She stood braced against the screaming wind, her body a bulwark against the collapsing barn wall, the great weight of the central beam settling onto her shoulders as splintered timbers rained down around her. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now, let me carry you back to where it truly began. She arrived with the dust, a solitary figure walking up the long, rutted track that led to the Callahan Ranch. She carried one canvas satchel, and the clothes she wore were clean but mended, poplin worn soft with years of hard use. The alkali flats shimmered in the heat, and the sun beat down on the crown of her hat, a merciless, indifferent hammer. Her name was Maylene, and she had come because a letter had found her. A letter speaking of a widower with a failing ranch and a child who no longer spoke. The letter had offered work. It had not offered welcome. Maylene had learned long ago not to expect welcome. She had learned that the world saw her first and last as a collection of excesses. She was too big. Her shoulders were broad, her hips wide, her arms and legs thick with a strength that was unseemly in a woman. She was too plain, her face a broad, still moon that did not offer the easy smiles or delicate expressions people sought. And she was too much herself, a fat Chinese woman in a world that had room only for the slender and the pale. Her bigness, her color, her too muchness. These were the things that defined her in the eyes of others. They were the reasons she had been dismissed from kitchens, turned away from sewing rooms, and looked through on the streets of a dozen hardscrabble towns. So she had built armor. It was an armor of stillness, a face kept placid and unreadable. It was an armor of competence. A knowledge of things that could not be denied. She knew the language of water and soil, of sick cattle and stressed timber. She knew the cold, hard grammar of a ledger book, the secret story told by columns of ink. She had learned that if she could not be liked, she could be necessary. And being necessary was a kind of safety. It was a temporary perch, a place to rest until her usefulness ended. And she was once more sent on her way. She expected this. She had built her life around the certainty of it. As she walked, her eyes took in the ranch, and she began to read its story of decay. It was a story of grief. The fences sagged, their posts leaning like tired old men. The irrigation ditch that should have been carrying life from the creek was choked with silt and tumbleweeds, its banks crumbling. A line of cottonwoods near the house showed the telltale signs of thirst, their leaves yellowed and curled at the edges. The land talked, and she had long ago learned its language. This land spoke of a hand that had lost its grip, of a heart that had lost its will. It spoke of a slow surrender. She reached the main house, a long, low structure of sun-bleached timber with a porch that listed to one side. A man sat there on the top step, staring out at nothing. He was lean and weathered, his hands resting on his knees, but there was a stillness to him that was not restful. It was the stillness of a stopped clock. He did not seem to notice her approach until her shadow fell over him. He looked up, his eyes a faded blue, clouded with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have settled into his very bones. This was Thomas Callahan. He looked at her size, at her face, and a flicker of something, disappointment, confusion, crossed his features before he masked it. "You are the one from the letter?" he asked. His voice was raspy, as if from disuse. "I am Maylene," she said, her own voice calm and even. He nodded slowly, looking away again. "The work is hard." "I am not afraid of work," she replied. She did not say more. She let the silence sit, let him measure her. Her gaze drifted past him, to the main well near the barn. She saw the problem instantly. The winch mechanism was sound, the rope new, but the ground around the wellhead was dark and damp, and a faint, sickly sweet smell hung in the air. The water that should have been life was poison. "Your well is soured," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "The alkali has leached into it from the runoff. Your cattle will not thrive on it, and your child should not drink it." He turned his head slowly, his gaze following hers. He looked at the well, then back at her. The exhaustion in his face warred with a spark of surprise, of something sharp and focused, breaking through the fog of his grief. He had lived with that failing well for a year, attributing the herd's weakness to bad luck, to the heat, to his own failing spirit. He had never seen the simple truth of it. He stood up, a little unsteady. He was taller than he looked sitting down, but he seemed hollowed out, a man made of dry wood in memory. He looked at her, truly looked at her this time, not at her size or her race, but at the clear, knowing certainty in her eyes. "Say that again," he said, his voice quiet. "The well is soured," she repeated patiently. "The casing is likely cracked below the surface. The water is bad. It is the first thing that must be fixed." He stared at her for a long moment. He had been expecting a cook, a housekeeper, someone to manage the domestic chaos his wife's passing had left behind. He had not been expecting this. He had not been expecting someone who could read his land's sickness in a single glance. For the first time in a year, a decision came to him not from a place of weary obligation, but from a flicker of something else, a flicker of hope. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "I can," she said. It was not a boast, it was the truth. And so, she was hired. Not for the kitchen, not for the mending, but for the well. The first thing she did was walk the land. She followed the dying creek bed, her eyes tracing the contours of the earth, searching for the old memory of water. She found it 2 miles north, a place where the ground held a deeper green, where a cluster of willows clung stubbornly to life. Here, the water ran clean and deep, hidden just beneath the surface. This would be the new source. She did not ask for help. She went to the workshop, a place thick with the dust of disuse, and found the tools she needed. She sharpened the blades of the shovels and picks herself, her movements economical and sure. She found a coil of old rope and tested its strength, knotting it with an expert's touch. Thomas Callahan watched her from the porch, a silent, gaunt figure. He saw the way she moved with a purpose that had long since deserted him. He saw a strength that was not just of the body, but of the spirit. She dug. For 3 days, under the relentless sun, she dug a trench. It was not a simple ditch, but a carefully graded channel, following the path of least resistance, coaxing the land to yield a path for the water. She worked with a steady, metronomic rhythm, her breath even, her face calm. The old armor of stillness served her well. It conserved her energy, it focused her mind, it kept the questions of the watching man at bay. On the 4th day, a man with one arm and a face like a dried riverbed came to watch. His name was Silas, the only hand who had not drifted away after the death of Callahan's wife. He stood with his one good hand on his hip, his expression a mixture of scorn and grudging curiosity. He watched her lift rocks that would have challenged a 2-armed man, watched her sight the line of the trench with an unerring eye. "Woman's work," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Mei Lin did not pause. She drove the pick into the hard pan earth, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. She did not look at him. She did not need his approval. She needed the water to run. She broke through to the hidden spring late on the 5th day. The water came at first as a trickle, then a steady, determined flow, cool and clear, filling the channel she had carved. It followed her work, a silver ribbon chasing her back towards the ranch. She guided it, cleared its path, and by nightfall, it was pouring into a new cistern she had lined with stone near the barn, bypassing the soured well forever. Thomas Callahan came down from the porch. He knelt by the cistern and cupped the water in his hands. He drank, and the taste was sweet and clean. He looked at the water, then at Mei Lin. She stood a few feet away, her clothes stained with sweat and dirt, her face impassive. He did not have the words for what he felt. The gratitude was a lump in his throat, so he just nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. It was enough. Her next challenge was the child. Her name was Ellie, a small bird-like girl of 7 with her father's sorrowful blue eyes. She had not spoken a word since her mother had died. She moved through the house like a ghost, a silent reproach to the world that had taken her mother away. She watched Mei Lin with a wary, unblinking stare. She saw another woman in her mother's kitchen, another presence in the quiet rooms of the house, and her silence deepened into a hard knot of resistance. Mei Lin did not try to force her way in. She understood that a broken heart was like a frightened animal. It had to be approached with stillness. She did not ask the girl questions. She did not demand smiles or conversation. Instead, she simply existed, a steady, predictable presence. She cooked, and the smell of baking bread and savory stew began to fill the empty spaces of the house. She would leave a small bowl of rice pudding or a cut apple on the kitchen table, and when she returned, it would be gone. She talked to herself as she worked, a low, quiet murmur. She spoke of the weather, of the chickens in the yard, of the color of the evening sky. She told stories to the pots and pans, simple tales of clever monkeys and brave fish she remembered from her own childhood. She filled the silence not with demands, but with gentle sound, weaving a tapestry of warmth for the child to enter, if she chose. One afternoon, Mei Lin was sitting on the back step, mending one of Ellie's dresses. The fabric was a faded blue poplin, torn at the hem. As she worked her needle, she began to hum a soft, simple tune. Ellie, who had been hiding behind the rain barrel, crept closer. She sat on the dusty ground a few feet away, watching Maylene's large, capable hands move with such delicate precision. The needle flashed. The thread followed. The torn hem became a neat, strong seam. Maylene finished her work and folded the dress. She looked over at the child, her face holding its usual calm. "Your mother?" Maylene said softly. "She must have loved blue." Ellie's eyes widened. She stared at Maylene, her small chest rising and falling. She looked at the mended dress, at the steady, quiet woman who had fixed it. A tremor ran through her. "She did," the girl whispered, the sound a fragile, rusty thing. It was the color of her eyes. Maylene's heart gave a lurch, a painful, hopeful beat. She did not press. She simply nodded. "It is a good color," she said, and that was all. But a door had opened. A small, cautious hand had reached out from the fortress of silence. Her victory with Silas was less gentle. It came during a late summer storm. A prize bull, a creature of immense size and foul temper, had been spooked by the lightning and had broken through its corral. It was rampaging near the house, its horns a deadly threat. Thomas was away, buying feed in town. It was just Silas, with his one good arm, and Maylene. Silas was trying to rope the animal, but he was outmatched. The bull charged him, and he scrambled away, tripping and falling hard. The bull lowered its head, ready to gore him. Maylene did not hesitate. She had been carrying a heavy fence post, preparing to mend the corral. She ran forward, planting her feet wide, and slammed the thick end of the post into the ground in front of her, angling it like a spear. She held it fast, her entire body a brace against the coming impact. The bull, seeing this new, unmoving obstacle, crashed into the post. The wood groaned, the shock vibrating up Maylene's arms and into her shoulders. A force that would have shattered a smaller person. But she held. Her bigness, her strength, the very things the world scorned, became a shield. The bull, stunned and confused, shook its massive head and backed away, its fury broken. Silas scrambled to his feet, his face pale. He looked at the bull, now trotting away meekly. He looked at the fence post, its end buried a foot in the hard earth. And he looked at Maylene, who was breathing heavily, her knuckles white where she gripped the wood. He walked over, his cynical expression gone, replaced by something akin to awe. He looked her up and down. "Damn," he said, the word a puff of pure astonishment. Just damn. From that day on, Silas followed her instructions without question. He began to speak of her not as the woman, but as the boss. He had seen her strength, and he respected it. She had earned her place. The ranch began to heal. Under her guidance, the fences were mended, the irrigation ditches cleared, the cattle grew stronger on the sweet water. The house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Ellie's voice, once a whisper, grew stronger, and soon she was chattering away, following Maylene everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. Thomas Callahan seemed to stand a little straighter. The deep lines of grief on his face began to soften. He watched Maylene, a quiet gratitude in his eyes that he still could not voice. For the first time in a long time, there was a fragile peace on the Callahan ranch. And then Jedediah Croft came to call. He arrived in a polished black buggy pulled by a handsome bay mare, a vision of prosperity in the dusty landscape. Croft was the town banker, a man whose wealth was as substantial as his girth. He was soft-bodied and heavy, his face a mask of pleasantry, with a smile that looked as if it had been set there with a trowel. He wore a fine suit of black bombazine, and his boots shone despite the dust. He greeted Thomas with a booming, hearty warmth that seemed to fill the air. "Thomas, my dear friend, it does my heart good to see some life returning to this place." He clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look like friendship but felt like ownership. Thomas, for his part, seemed to shrink a little under the man's presence. "Jedediah, it's good of you to come out." Croft's eyes, small and shrewd, swept over the ranch, noting the repairs, the healthy cattle, the general air of improvement. Then his gaze fell on Maylene, who stood on the porch watching them. He surveyed her from head to toe, a slow, appraising look, the kind a man gives a piece of livestock he is considering for purchase. "Well now, Thomas," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "I see you found yourself some substantial help." He smiled directly at Maylene, but it did not reach his eyes. "A truly sturdy specimen. Hard work must come easy to a woman of her build." The words were a physical blow. Substantial, sturdy specimen. He spoke of her as if she were a draft horse, an object. It was the old, familiar wound, the casual dismissal of her humanity. The old armor of her still face held firm, She did not react. She simply met his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. But inside, a cold, hard knot of anger formed. She had seen men like Jedediah Croft before, men who used smiles as weapons and kindness as a cloak for their greed. Thomas, lost in his own misplaced gratitude to the banker, did not see the insult. He just nodded. Maylin is a hard worker. Later that week, Thomas brought home a new ledger book. The old one was a mess of scrawled, grief-stricken entries and unpaid bills. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of the debt that was slowly strangling him. He owed so much to the bank, to Jedediah Croft. Maylin was clearing the supper dishes. She watched him for a moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I can read a ledger," she said quietly. Thomas looked up, surprised. It was a skill he had never considered she might possess. Her competence had been so physical, so tied to the land and to labor. He hesitated, then pushed the heavy book across the table towards her. "Be my guest," he said, his voice flat with despair. "It's a map of my own ruin." She sat down and opened the book. The ink smelled of worry and desperation, but beneath the chaotic entries, she saw another story. She lit a lamp and began to work, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers. She pulled out the loan agreements from the bank, the receipts for feed, the deeds for the land. She worked late into the night, long after Thomas and Ellie had gone to bed. The house was silent, save for the scratching of her pen on a spare sheet of paper and the soft hiss of the lamp. And as the hours passed, the picture became devastatingly clear. It was not a map of Thomas's ruin. It was a blueprint for it, carefully and cruelly designed by Jedediah Croft. The interest rates on the loans were predatory, compounding in a way that was deliberately confusing. The prices listed for seed and feed bought on credit from Croft's Mercantile were inflated by half again their actual cost. But the true evil was buried in the deed itself. A clause, written in dense legal language, stipulated that in the event of a default, not only the ranch, but its associated water rights, the most valuable asset in that dry country, would revert directly to the bank, and the final payment was due in 1 month. A payment Thomas could not possibly make. Jedediah Croft had not been helping Thomas Callahan through his grief. He had been using it. He had been patiently, systematically bleeding him dry, all while wearing the mask of a friend. The man's smile was a lie, his kindness was poison, and he was about to steal everything. Maylin closed the ledger, the cold knot of anger in her stomach now a block of ice. The next morning, she laid it all out for Thomas on the kitchen table. She had organized the papers into neat piles, the fraudulent invoices, the predatory loan notes, the deed with the damning clause circled in pencil. She explained it calmly, factually, her voice never rising. She showed him how each act of kindness from Croft had been a turn of the screw, tightening the trap. Thomas listened, his face growing paler with each revelation. He shook his head, a gesture of denial. "No," he whispered, "that can't be. Jedediah, he paid for Sarah's doctor. He paid for the funeral when I had nothing. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't." The past kindness was a blindfold he could not bring himself to remove. He trusted the memory of that help more than the hard evidence in front of him. Maylin understood. The debt he felt was not just financial, it was emotional. It was a powerful chain. She did not argue with his feelings. She pointed to the numbers. "The money for the doctor," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He did not give it to you. He added it to your loan, at 30% interest. He made you pay for his charity 10 times over. It is here, in his own handwriting." She pushed the ledger towards him. He stared at the entry, at the date that corresponded with his wife's final illness. He saw the sum, and then he saw the cruel mathematics that followed. The blindfold tore. The trust he had placed in the man, the gratitude he had harbored for years, it all crumbled into ash. His grief had made him a fool, and his friend had been a vulture all along. A terrible, shuddering sigh escaped him. He looked up from the papers, his eyes finding hers. The fog of sorrow was gone, replaced by a slow-burning fire. He saw her then, not as a hired hand, not as a strange, oversized woman, but as the one person who had seen the truth, the one person who had stood between his family and utter ruin. "All right," he said, and the words were a vow. "All right, Maylin." It was the first time he had said her name with its full weight. It was the moment they ceased to be employer and employee. They became partners. They became allies in a quiet war. The rains came 2 weeks later. Not the gentle, life-giving rains of spring, but a hard, violent deluge that turned the dry creek into a raging torrent. The sky was a bruised purple, and thunder cracked like the sky breaking apart. A flash flood, sudden and ferocious, came roaring down the canyon. It hit the ranch without warning, a wall of brown water and debris. The new cistern held, but the barn, its foundation weakened by years of neglect, began to groan under the assault of the floodwaters. Part of the back wall gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The herd, terrified, was trapped inside. Ellie, who had been playing with a litter of kittens in the hayloft, screamed. Thomas was already fighting to reinforce the main doors when he heard his daughter's cry. He turned, his face a mask of horror, just as the central beam of the barn, the massive timber that held the entire roof aloft, splintered with a deafening crack. The whole structure was about to collapse. Mei Lin was there. She had been securing the livestock pens. She saw the beam break, saw the terror on Thomas's face, heard the child scream. Without a thought, she ran into the failing structure. She did not run for the ladder to the loft. She ran to the center of the barn, directly under the failing beam. She planted her feet, bent her knees, and shoved her shoulders up against the immense weight of the cracking timber. The wood groaned and settled, its crushing force driving down on her. Pain, white-hot and immediate, shot through her back and legs. But she held. Her body, her bigness, her too-muchness became a living pillar. She became the one thing holding back the death of the world. "Thomas," she yelled, her voice strained with the colossal effort. "Get the child." Her cry broke him from his frozen horror. He scrambled up the ladder, grabbed a terrified Ellie, and half fell, half climbed back down. Silas, who had come running from the bunkhouse, helped him drag the girl out into the rain. "The beam won't hold," Silas shouted over the roar of the storm. "It's going to go." Thomas turned back, his heart seizing. Mei Lin was still there, braced against the impossible weight, her face a mask of agony and determination. He started to run back for her, but she roared at him. "The herd! Get the herd out!" He hesitated for only a second. Then he understood. She was buying them time. He and Silas worked with a desperate fury, cutting the ropes, driving the panicked cattle out of the collapsing barn and towards higher ground. The last cow scrambled to safety just as Mei Lin's strength finally gave out. With a final, catastrophic groan, the beam shattered. She threw herself sideways, tucking and rolling as the entire roof of the barn came crashing down in a storm of timber and splintered wood. Thomas screamed her name. He ran towards the wreckage, clawing at the debris with his bare hands, his mind a whirlwind of terror. He found her half buried under a section of the collapsed roof, a heavy rafter lying across her legs. She was unconscious, a cut bleeding on her forehead, but she was alive. He and Silas managed to lift the timber off her. Thomas gathered her into his arms. He was shocked at how heavy she was. A solid, real weight. He carried her through the driving rain to the house, his gratitude so fierce and painful it was indistinguishable from love. He laid her on his own bed, and as he gently cleaned the cut on her forehead with a damp cloth, his hand trembled. He brushed a stray strand of wet black hair from her face. It was the first time he had ever touched her with tenderness. It was a touch that acknowledged everything she was, everything she had done. He had saved his child, his herd, his future, all because of the impossible strength of this woman. Jedediah Croft heard about the flood, and he heard about the collapsed barn. He must have thought it was the final blow, the act of God that would deliver the Callahan Ranch into his hands. When Mei Lin was finally able to walk again, her leg wrapped in bandages, she and Thomas rode into town. Croft, seeing them approach the bank, came out onto the steps, his face arranged in an expression of deep, sorrowful concern. "Thomas, my poor boy," he began, his voice oozing false sympathy. "I heard about the tragedy. A terrible loss. A terrible, terrible loss." But Croft had underestimated his opponent. He realized Mei Lin was a threat, but he believed her a simple one, a creature of brute strength. He did not know about her mind, so he had shifted his attack. He had started a campaign of whispers. The talk spread through the town like fire through dry grass, that the Chinese woman was a heathen, an unmarried woman living in a widower's house, that her influence over Callahan was unnatural, unseemly, that she was a grasping opportunist, taking advantage of a grieving man. The whispers found their target in Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town reverend and the undisputed leader of its decent women. Mrs. Gable was a woman shaped by her own loss. She had buried 2 children in the small cemetery behind the church. Her grief had hardened into a fierce, protective righteousness. She saw the world in stark terms of right and wrong, and she saw Mei Lin as a profound wrong. She confronted Mei Lin in the street outside the Mercantile. She was flanked by two other women, their faces set in grim judgment. "You," Mrs. Gable said, her voice sharp, "you should be ashamed, living in that poor man's house, in his grief. You have no decency." Mei Lin stopped. She looked at the woman, at the pain that was the true source of her anger. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. Instead, she looked directly into Mrs. Gable's eyes, and her own gaze was filled with a deep and startling empathy. "You lost a child," Mei Lin said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "No, two children. I see the memory of it in your face. It is a sorrow that never leaves. It changes the shape of the world." Mrs. Gable flinched as if struck. The other women looked on, confused. This was not the confrontation they had expected. "You fear for Mr. Callahan's daughter," Mei Lin continued, her voice still quiet and gentle. "You fear another child will suffer a loss. You believe you are protecting her. Your heart is good, even if your words are mistaken." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. She had made it for Ellie during the long days of her recovery. She held it out to Mrs. Gable. "A child's heart is a fragile thing," Mei Lin said. "I would never harm it. I know what it is to lose everything. I am not his enemy, and I am not yours." Mrs. Gable stared at the bird in Mei Lin's hand. She stared at the woman's calm, sad, knowing eyes. She saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own ancient grief. The righteous anger drained out of her, leaving her shaken and uncertain. She did not take the bird. She simply turned, her face pale, and walked away, her allies trailing behind her in confused silence. The attack had been met not with force, but with understanding, and it had been completely disarmed. Now, on the steps of the bank, Croft prepared to deliver his final, triumphant speech. He had called in the note. The whole town was there, drawn by the drama of a good man's fall. "It is with the heaviest of hearts," Croft boomed, projecting for the crowd, "that I must foreclose on the Callahan property. I extended my friendship, my credit, my Christian charity, but a man cannot fight fate. Thomas, my friend, I am so sorry." Thomas stood silent and grim-faced beside Mei Lin. He had insisted she be the one. Mei Lin stepped forward. She held the thick ledger book in her hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried over the silent crowd. "You are not his friend," she said, looking directly at Jedediah Croft. "You are a thief." A gasp went through the crowd. Croft's smile tightened. "Now see here, this is hardly the place for hysterics from—" "On August the 10th, 2 years ago," Mei Lin continued, her voice cutting through his, "you paid Dr. Miller's bill for Sarah Callahan. You told Thomas it was a gift, but you recorded it here, in this ledger, as a loan. A loan at 30% interest, compounded monthly." She opened the book and pointed to the entry, her finger steady. "On October the 1st, she went on, her voice relentless, "you sold him 50 sacks of winter seed. You charged him $2 a sack. The price at the cooperative in the next county was $1. It is recorded here." She went on and on, page by page, date by date. She laid the entire scheme bare for the whole town to see. The inflated prices, the usurious rates, the quiet manipulation of a grieving man's accounts. She spoke in the cold, irrefutable language of numbers. She unwove his tapestry of lies, thread by thread. The crowd murmured, their expressions shifting from pity for Thomas to suspicion, then to outright anger towards Croft. The banker's face began to lose its pleasant mask. The color rose in his soft cheeks. "Finally," Mei Lin said, her voice ringing with clarity, "the deed to the ranch, with a clause buried on page 7 that grants not only the land, but all water rights to the bank upon default. The same water rights you have been trying to buy from every rancher in this valley for 5 years." The trowel smile finally cracked. It fell away, revealing the ugly, rapacious greed beneath. "You have no right," Croft snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. "You are nothing, a fat, foreign thing. He should have left you in whatever gutter he found you in." The ugliness of his words hung in the shocked silence. He had revealed himself completely. And then a new voice spoke, clear and strong. "She is right." Every head turned. Mrs. Gable stepped out from the crowd. She walked up the steps and stood beside Mei Lin. She looked at Croft with eyes of cold, righteous fury. "This woman," she declared, her voice trembling with conviction, has more decency and Christian charity in her heart than you have ever known. She is a protector of children, and you, Jedediah Croft, are a viper. That was all it took. The dam of public opinion broke. Silas stepped forward, his one good arm held stiffly at his side. She stood against a charging bull for me, he said gruffly, and held up a barn roof. She's more of a man than you'll ever be, Croft. Others began to speak. The blacksmith, the mercantile owner, other ranchers who had felt the squeeze of Croft's bank. The chorus of condemnation rose, and Jedediah Croft, exposed and ruined, stumbled backward into his bank and slammed the door. His power in the town was broken forever. 2 years passed. 2 years of hard work and steady growth. The Callahan Ranch, now known as the Callahan Lynn Ranch to those who knew the truth of it, was not just saved. It was thriving. The barn was rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before. The herds were the healthiest in the county. The fields fed by the sweet water Maylene had found were green and lush. It was a showplace, a testament to what could be built with intelligence and strength. Maylene was the heart of it all. She was no longer just a hired hand. She was the master of the place, her word law. Silas took her orders as if they were gospel. Ellie, now a bright and talkative 9-year-old, was never far from her side. Her love for Maylene fierce and absolute. Mrs. Gable was her closest friend, the two women bound by a shared understanding of grief and resilience. The armor Maylene had worn for so long had grown thin, loosened by the steady friction of acceptance and love. One evening in late summer, she was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set. The light was long and gold, painting the hills in honeyed tones. The air was cool and smelled of hay and dust and the coming night. Thomas came and sat beside her. He was quiet for a long time, watching the sky with her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a deep, quiet emotion. "I remember when you first came here," he said. I don't know what I thought. I just needed a pair of hands. I expected so little." He shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. "And then you fixed the well. You healed my daughter. You faced down Silas and the bull and the flood. You held up my whole world when it was falling down around me." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a profound and humble awe. "The world told you that you were too much," he said, his voice thick. "Too big, too strong, too plain. Jedediah Croft called you a sturdy specimen. He was a fool. Everyone was a fool. Your bigness is what held that beam up. Your strength is what saved my herd. Your stubborn, solid too-muchness is what saved me. You are not too much, Maylene. You were just enough." He reached out and took her hand. His was calloused and warm. "This place, it's yours as much as it is mine. I want your name on the deed. An equal partner. In everything." He paused, his grip tightening on her hand. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need you. The ranch is saved. I'm asking you to stay because I want you." And in that long, golden light, Maylene felt the last remnants of the old armor fall away. All the years of being dismissed, of being too much, of being looked through, it all dissolved into nothing. The pain she had carried for a lifetime was finally lifted. She was not an object, not a specimen, not a temporary convenience. She was seen. She was valued. She was loved for the very things she had been taught to hide. She turned to him, her still face breaking into a slow, beautiful, true smile. "Yes,